never know what will be open in a tab. But anyways, welcome everyone. Like the introduction shared, my name is Jimin. I'm currently a master's student in comparative literature and critical translation at the University of Oxford. And prior to Oxford, I was at Princeton where I studied Spanish and Portuguese. So yesterday I had the honor of looking through the demographics list, and I'm super excited to see so many of you from all across the world speaking so many different languages. And I'd love to learn a little more about you guys and your linguistic repertoires when we get to the Q&A section eventually. All right, so today I will be talking about multilingual literature. And the title of my presentation, as you can see here, will be Multilingual Writers and Multilingual Worlds. So, as a brief disclaimer, I myself am pretty new to the concept of multilingual literatures. It's something that I didn't, deeply consider until I got to my graduate program. But once I did, I realized that it was something incredibly fascinating, especially for someone who has a background in multiple languages. And I really wish that I'd had a primer in it when I was younger, so i.e. your age. And so I hope I'll be able to provide a nice introduction for you all so that you can start experimenting with multilingual literatures in your own lives. Okay, so first of all, to start off with a quick introduction, I'll be talking about what multilingualism actually is, how it relates to literature, and then the question of what multilingual literature looks like. So to begin, we live in a world that is incredibly linguistically diverse. And even for those of us who are monolingual, we inadvertently find ourselves speaking in multiple languages all the time. So, for the purposes of this presentation, which I'm delivering in English, English is the shared language that we have. And in English alone, you have an incredible amount of linguistic diversity. So for example, loanwords, the word banana, I learned, came from Wolof through Spanish or Portuguese. The word algebra comes from the Arabic, literature from French. You might go to a cafe for lunch and order a hummus, which is not an English word in terms of its origin. Or you might go to a Japanese cafe and order a tonkatsu. All over the world, because of the forces of colonialism, you have different countries where English is the native language. So for instance, in Nigeria, in India, in Singapore, and in all these places, people speak English, but incorporating frames of reference that might not be present in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, where English is also, the lingua franca. And last but not least, you have different functions of linguistic diversity. So one of my professors here really loves the idea that you have different uses for languages internal to the language itself. So you have, for example, within English, literary English, which you can read in Shakespeare, or you have the English you find in instruction manuals for your washing machine, which uses a completely different register. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the literary critic Susan Sontag, but I once read that she famously would study manuals regarding pressure pumps in order to think about new metaphors to describe pressure and movement. Just goes to show the extent to which writers go to think about new metaphors and ways of using their language. So that's an introduction about kind of linguistic diversity. And now I want to switch over to this idea of literature. So literature, we read all the time, we engage with all the time, and it has different purposes across different cultural backgrounds. So within the Western tradition, which is what I'll be talking about more today because this presentation is in English, much of what literature is has been premised on the concept of mimesis, which is the idea of the mimicry of life as it is. So there's a lot of scholarship available about how it is that authors are able to capture this sense of mimesis or how they're able to reflect reality in their prose, because it is quite unnatural, right? Like I'm here right now speaking, moving, living my life. And if I were to transcribe it into text, I'm moving a physical form into a textual one. This might get a little bit too academic, but what I want you to think about is the fact that, we can't take for granted the fact that literature exists. There's always an author putting in the work to reflect the reality that they are living in. So mimesis is a term you could look into later on. Plato and Aristotle first used it to refer to the practice and product of artistic or literary representation. And the word is linked to the words mime, like miming, and mimic in the English. So at least in this Western tradition, what I wanted to establish is that when we read printed literature, we are essentially engaging with the way an author is reflecting their reality. And so if our realities include multilingual repertoires, as I discussed before, with this incredible linguistic diversity, then why don't we try to use literature as a platform with which to reflect this linguistic diversity, which is really the way the world is anyways. And that leads me to my next point on multilingual literatures. So there are different examples that fall under this definition, but essentially to give the TLDR description of what multilingual literature is, it's essentially literature that incorporates different languages. Sometimes, it could be a ratio of, for if the text is in English, one non-English word for 100 English words, or 50 to 50, anything that kind of shows linguistic diversity, I would consider multilingual literature. But taking a step back, from what this literature actually is, it's interesting to think about why different writers choose to write multilingually in the first place. So there's a scholar called Stephen Kelman who has this book called The Translingual Imagination. And for those of you who are interested in the more academic scholarship regarding this field, you should definitely read it. And he talks about various reasons as to why writers write multilingually. So first of all, you have events that can happen to people. Colonialism, war, increased mobility, and the aesthetics of alienation, he writes, have combined to create a canon of translingual literature. And so when people move around, are forced to migrate, you might have instances where writers encounter new linguistic worlds. That was the case of a writer named Eva Hoffman, who's pretty well known in the multilingual literature sphere, who I think grew up in Poland speaking Polish, but then emigrated to the US when she was young, and so lived between both languages throughout her life. I also wanted to take a moment here to recognize what is happening in the Ukraine with, I think, an estimated 1.5 million people displaced at the moment, moving to different countries. Just the gravity of the situation there and the extent to which language is incredibly fraught as they find new homes is something I think it's worth reflecting on in this presentation. Anyways, for these reasons, there are certain themes, I think, that kind of come to the forefront in multilingual literatures more so than in other genres. So for example, themes of displacement, of movement, of migration, of metamorphosis. So these are kind of themes that you might want to explore if you kind of go down this route of writing in this genre. And last but not least, you have writers with different motivations as to why they would write multilingually. And there are some writers who talk about grappling with the hegemony of a single language in their minds, or they feel like a certain language might help them access a part of themselves that another language wouldn't. In social linguistics, there's this theory called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically says that different languages equip you with different methods of expression. Some people really like that idea, other people really don't. And I, in my education, have been taught more to agree with the latter group because I'm of the belief that every language is equally equipped to express whatever we want to express. So whatever I feel in Korean could also be expressed in Swahili, could also be expressed in Hindi. But then again, having said that, I also recognize that I have a different relationship to each of the languages that I have. So, for example, in Korean, which is the language that I spoke growing up as a child, I'm very comfortable speaking about issues of the home. And say, like in Portuguese, I can speak about the economy in a way that I can't in Korean. And sometimes I have more of an academic relationship to Portuguese. And that's kind of for you to figure out and decide how you relate to the different languages in your life. But ultimately, as a way of kind of wrapping this section up, Stephen Kelman asks this really beautiful question, which is, does the writer choose the language or does the language choose the writer? And I think that is just an invitation for all of us to write naturally in the way that you want, reflect your reality in the way that you want. And perhaps in that process, you'll be able to discover what essence of the world you want to express in what language. To give you a few examples of multilingual writers who are considered canonical or that I admire, here's a brief list. You might see the title here. I wrote multilingual and exophonic writers. Exophonic basically means just someone who writes in a language that they learned later on in life or that they weren't born with. So for example, Samuel Beckett, he's an Irishman, but a lot of his most famous works were written in French. Or Jhumpa Lahiri, as you'll see on the left, embarked on this project where after years of writing in English and being incredibly commercially successful in English, she did a 180-degree shift and started writing exclusively in Italian. She wrote in her journal in Italian. She only read Italian prose. She went to live in Italy. And the resultant text that came out of it, which is called In Other Words, is a beautiful meditation on the ways in which we adopt languages into our lives and make new worlds with them. I really admire Jhumpa Lahiri. She perhaps is one of my favorite writers, and I think her project essentially is what motivated me to be here at all. So I have a lot to thank her for, and I highly recommend reading In Other Words if you haven't read it yet. You also have David Hoon Kim, another contemporary writer who I found out about only very recently. So he is Korean American, but he was educated in France and went to a writing program there. So he was producing a lot of writing in French, but then he went to Iowa in the US and started writing in English. And he writes for both French and English language publications. And that's one thing that you can think about, where do you want to publish your work if you eventually come around to publishing it? And in what languages do you want to write these texts? Junot Diaz is from the Dominican Republic, currently lives in, no, I don't think he lives in New Jersey. I think he teaches at MIT, but a lot of his characters are based in New Jersey because there's a big Dominican Republic community there. So I went to college in New Jersey. And so Junot Diaz is someone that we talked about quite a fair bit in some of my classes. And his characters speak, English, but with inflections of Spanish, but not, Spanish in itself has so much linguistic diversity, as I'm sure many of you know. There's not only Spanish spoken in Spain, but there's Spanish spoken across Latin America, and the Spanish in Argentina can look different from the Spanish spoken in Venezuela. And so he incorporates specific kind of Dominicanized, Americanized Spanish English into the prose of his characters, which I think is phenomenal. And you can also check him out. Last but not least, Vladimir Nabokov, you can see here. He was born in Russia, I believe, but then wrote in English. So yeah, just some examples to get your minds rolling. And now I think we're gonna switch into the next part, but before we do, I have an important disclaimer. I have a chat thing here. Oh, thank you so much for your lovely comment. I appreciate it. Yeah, and if any of you have any questions, always feel free to write it down in the chat box as well. So before we get into the fun part where I discuss, methods to possibly incorporate different languages into your texts, an important disclaimer. So you guys might have heard of this concept of the one nation, one language model. If you've studied any sociolinguistics before, but if you haven't, no worries. It's a very simple concept. So basically, the one nation, one language model posits that languages have concrete borders drawn between them in the same way that countries do. So for example, people who believe in this model think that any given language has characteristics unique to the country in which it is most widely spoken or it is most commonly associated with. So for example, Italian is to Italy what Spanish is to Spain, and Korean is to Korea what Chinese is to China, for example. And although it can be, an easy and convenient way to understand language diversity and the way it overlaps with cultural diversity, it is also tremendously limiting because it assumes that cultural or linguistic authenticity is based on factors that are very arbitrary. Because, you and I, we can't choose what countries we're born into. We don't choose what languages we're born speaking. But sometimes, underneath this one nation, one language model is this idea that if you're not a native speaker, then you can't achieve native speaker fluency. And there's a sense of kind of boxing people into those who are authentically of a certain language and culture and those who aren't, which can be a very dangerous, not dangerous, but kind of, it doesn't give justice, I think, to the diversity that all of us have. And it kind of, sometimes stops people from embracing the fact that, their identities are hybrid. For the longest time, I thought I was just, not very Korean, but also like, not very from Hong Kong, which is where I grew up. But I met a professor in undergrad who was Korean Argentinian, and she was like, I am all Korean and I'm also all Argentinian. We're allowed to be all of these things, which was an incredibly moving concept for me to learn. And you can also learn it too by watching this brilliant TED Talk by Tai Selassie, who is a Ghanaian writer, Ghanaian born and London raised, I want to say, and then since she's been all over the world. But she has a brilliant TED Talk called Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, Ask Where I'm a Local, which you can find on YouTube. And it was really stunning for me to realize that there are ways in which to introduce the countries you're from that links to the languages you speak without necessarily having to box yourself into a certain nation state or the other. Okay, so writing multilingually. How can we start writing our own multilingual literatures? Here are some methods that are like not official at all. These are just some notes that I've been taking for myself over the past couple of months. And mind you, I just started my master's program in October, so it hasn't been that long either. And so if any of you guys have any suggestions, I'd love to hear it after this. So first of all, paying attention, which is something we should all be doing anyways, but I wanted to highlight it because I think that the most important part of being a writer or a person of any kind is to be able to pay attention. Because when you pay attention to sounds, to smells, tastes, experiences, feelings, you are made capable of rendering these senses into prose, doing that mimesis, as I've told you about earlier, which in turn gets transmitted to other people. And I think that really is where the beauty of literature lies. So pay attention to the world that you live in. If we live in a linguistically diverse world, think about where in my life, on the streets, in my home, in my classroom, am I seeing the existence of multiple languages? Next, you might want to emulate multilingual speech patterns that you recognize on a day-to-day basis. Because you might have a multilingual repertoire where you mix different tongues. Your parents might, your friends might. This is an example I want to give. I know that there's a huge contingent of Brazilians at this conference, which is very cool. I should have said this earlier. I lived in Brazil for a year before I started my undergrad, and Portuguese is one of the languages that I hold dearest to my heart. But I have a Brazilian friend here at Oxford who has a multilingual repertoire. So she incorporates a lot of Portuguese into her English speech. She uses the word tipo a lot, which in English is kind of like, when people say like as a verbal filler, it has a similar function. And she was telling me about going to a Sainsbury's here where she asked for a small bag. But instead of, asking for a small bag, she asked for a bagzinho. And zinho is a diminutive form, which is attached to words to make it kind of a cutesy, smaller version of itself. But as you can see, bag is bag, it's an English word. And she was talking about how funny it was that the supermarket clerk got very confused for obvious reasons. But I thought that was a really interesting example of how different languages come together in people's multilingual speech. So yeah, paying attention to those things and incorporating it can be one way to approach this kind of writing. Next, you could think about using association-rich nouns. So instead of writing mother, mom, or mum, I've come to start using 엄마, which is a Korean word for mother, in my writing when I'm writing a personal essay, because my mom is Korean, or in cases where I choose to write about a Korean protagonist. And that's because I think in my personal conception of the word 엄마, it carries a deeper cultural connotation than mother, mom, or mom does. And I think because of the richness of that association, which not only indicates, the relationship I have with this other woman in my life, but rather someone who has cooked for me, taken care of me, has made me who I am, I think makes my writing richer. But, we always do this anyways, right? Like we say hummus when we go to a restaurant, we ask for tabbouleh, why don't we also ask for jjigae instead of saying a generic stew or soup? Because those aren't the same. Well, I guess functionally sometimes they are, but the nuances you don't want to lose. And so think about these words that you use in day-to-day life and try to kind of incorporate them into your text. Next, you could play around with setting, nationality, and place. So how can you combine the cultures that you hold close to you into the same text? And you will find that naturally, if you write about experiences that incorporate different linguistic repertoires, they will bleed into your text as well. So for the longest time, I've been trying to work on a short story based on an experience that I did have, where after I lived in Brazil, I moved back briefly to Korea before starting my undergrad in the US. I know it's a lot of steps, but I worked as a waitress at a Brazilian churrascaria, which is like an all-you-can-eat steakhouse, in the most American neighborhood in South Korea. And so, every day we would have customers who were Korean because we were in Korea. We would also have a lot of American soldiers because there was a base nearby speaking English, and I spoke in Portuguese with the wait staff. So already my linguistic repertoire was being fully activated in that environment. And I think any story that I will attempt to write from that experience will naturally have to incorporate all of those languages. So think to yourself about situations you've been in where you've been surrounded by a lot of different languages and play with that. And last but not least, when you do incorporate different languages into your prose, think about whether or not you want to incorporate a translation into the text or not. There are multiple reasons why a writer might choose to add a translation or not to add a translation. And this is what I kind of wanted to go into a little bit next. So in what circumstances might one want to incorporate translation into their prose? So if you're using a non-English language in a majority English text, obviously there will be readers who won't be able to understand that non-English language, and incorporating translation might help you reach a broader audience, which in turn will help normalize multilingual repertoires in written text, one thing to think about. But in other situations, writers don't want to add that translation in necessarily. And why not? Sometimes there is value in language being opaque, in not understanding. So for example, recently I wrote a paper about the use of French-English bilingualism in Henry James and James Baldwin, to American writers who at some point in their lives moved to Europe and had a lot of interesting things to say about the transcontinental American European identity. And in James Baldwin's book, Giovanni's Room, which is a beautiful, beautiful novel, he has these sections where the character uses French, but he doesn't offer an English translation. So if you don't read French, and I do very minimal French, not a lot of it, what the character is saying kind of remains opaque to you as a reader. And that kind of acts as a literary device in a way, because the book is all about, things that we fail to communicate to people that we love, which I thought was really powerful. And next, sometimes you just want your text to resonate more with certain audiences. For example, if I wrote something about myself, right, having been born in Korea, raised in Hong Kong, learned Mandarin at school, and I incorporated all three of those languages into the text, then other people who've had a similar upbringing or somehow have relationships with those languages might be able to be like, oh, this writer is writing for me because, I don't need a translation and they're not offering one. So clearly it is for this specific pocket of the world that this text is directed to, which can be a very special experience. I'm sure some of you have had experiences with that with books where you read it and you feel like, wow, this book is really speaking to me. You can also achieve that with the way you use and manipulate language. And how might you incorporate translations if you choose to do so or not? I wanted to give you some concrete examples because examples are always helpful and hopeful. So this is an excerpt from an Argentinian writer named Javier Cine, who I met very recently. He has a new book out called The Murders of Moisesville. It was written in Spanish and recently translated into English by a man called Robert Kroll, so you guys can check it out. But here's an excerpt that I wanted to share, where in the beginning, he has this Yiddish and he leaves it in the original prose. So you have this visual code that signals to you like, okay, this is not an English language, but he doesn't offer you a translation. And interestingly, right after he offers that, the Yiddish, the next paragraph starts with, and I understand nothing. So you see here, it makes sense that he doesn't offer you the translation because he's trying to mirror for the reader the opacity that he, as the person originally encountering this Yiddish, encountered. But later on in the next paragraph, he writes, as a popular Yiddish saying goes, es ist schwer zu sein naiv, it is hard to be a Jew. And here, with the transliteration of the Yiddish into an alphabet, a Latin alphabet that you can read, you're not only able to have it in your mouth and say it, but he also gives you the translation right after that. So that you, as a non-Yiddish reader, and some of you might speak fluent Yiddish here, will be able to understand. So that's a really creative way of kind of mixing in the different languages in your prose, should you wish to experiment with that. I also wanted to give you an example from something that I've written. It has not been published, so it's still kind of looking for a home, but it's an essay about my relationship with my mom, but through the lens of faith and prayer and going to college in America. And so it was a text that required a lot of Korean and English, I think, to exist together, because otherwise I felt like I wasn't being true to what the story was trying to say, because I've always only spoken in Korean with my mom. So this is a scene where I talk about a prayer that I had memorized. And as you can see, I, like Javier, incorporate the Korean text as a visual code for, enter a different language, but I weave in the translation in between. So you have, 전능하신 하느님과 형제들에게 고백하오니, we would say, our heads bent, I confess to God Almighty before the whole company of heaven that I've sinned in thought, word, and deed. And it doesn't have to be one and then the other, one and the other, in this formulaic way. And I do that later on when I continue the prayer, and there's a part where there's a repetition, and I kind of intersperse them in a way that feels somewhat unusual in texts that incorporate multiple languages. Chatasio by my fault, thump. Chatasio by my fault, thump. Chaikun by most grievous thump, tashiomida. I wanted to share that as an example for another way you could try braiding different languages together in a text. Okay, some of you might be poets or do completely different genres, filmmaking, that sort of thing. Always, this stuff is all applicable. But Stephen Kelman does have an interesting thing to say in the Translingual Imagination, where he says, all else being equal, translingualism is a more arduous process for a poet or a short story writer whose primary unit is the individual irreducible word than it is for the novelist or playwright who can divert us from solecisms with compelling plots and characters, and for whom language might be merely instrumental. all that to say, the less words that you have, the more tricky it might become to incorporate multiple linguistic worlds. But I see that less as kind of like a warning and more like an invitation to just try it out. So I'd love to see what you guys get up to. And before I conclude and let you know how you can reach me, I wanted to point out that when it comes to issues of translation and language, one of the most wonderful things to do is consider new metaphors with which we consider the role language plays in our lives. So one of my professors here, he's really, really interested in kind of debunking this idea that languages are distinct entities. And he wrote this, beautiful thing, which reads, "Languages are not distinct entities between which translation can jump. They do not have a clear border separating the words that are citizens of one from the words that are citizens of another." And he invites us to imagine our languages living together kind of in one city without borders as neighbors, lovers, friends, classmates. And I just love that image of seeing the languages that you use in day-to-day life convening together, loving one another. And perhaps it is, incredibly generative to have that image in mind as you approach your own multilingual projects. Okay, well, that is my email. If you ever experiment with multilingual literature, I would be more than happy to take a look because I really think that this is the future of literature and would love to read all of your projects. You can also find me on Twitter, which is where I share a lot of my work. So you'll be able to keep in touch with me there. But thank you so much for listening to me. And I would love to hear any thoughts or comments that you have.